Recap. I'm Daniel.
And I'm Mira.
So right off the bat, I want to clarify that this is a weekend special edition of the show. We are stepping away from our daily market recap format today to do a really thorough deep dive into a singular, highly significant research report that just dropped.
Yeah, and before we really get into the weeds of this corporate strategy, I just want to take a second and talk directly to you, the listener. Because, we know exactly what your screens have looked like over the last few months.
Oh, it's been brutal.
It really has. You have just survived a viciously volatile March 2026. We were all watching the ticker tape as the S&P 500 dipped dangerously close to that 6,500 level. We saw the VIX, the fear gauge spike to nearly 30.
Yeah, the emotional whiplash was real.
Completely. And then we saw this incredibly sharp recovery in April, right? With the S&P 500 surging past 7,100 and the NASDAQ hitting 24,800. It is exhausting. It takes a massive amount of grit and, frankly, a really strong stomach to hold your positions through that kind of slump. So you've earned a moment to just step back from the daily noise and look at the bigger picture with a sense of weary respect for the markets.
Weary respect. I like that. That is exactly the right posture to have right now. And I think it sets the stage perfectly for the monumental news that dropped on April 20th. Apple announced that Tim Cook is stepping back to become executive chairman, and John Ternus will officially take over as chief executive officer on September 1st, 2026.
Right. And alongside that, Johny Srouji is being elevated to chief hardware officer.
Exactly. So if you are that exhausted but relieved investor we just described, you have to be asking, why does this specific executive reshuffle actually matter to my portfolio today?
Well, it matters because Apple is flashing a massive signal to the market here. They are basically declaring that the post-GPT AI era is no longer just a software race happening in the cloud. It is a product architecture problem.
Right.
They are betting the future of a multi-trillion-dollar empire on a fundamentally engineering-first strategy.
Which is a huge pivot. But just to set the ground rules before you go down this rabbit hole, this deep dive is entirely for market context and intellectual discussion.
Absolutely.
We're analyzing corporate strategy, hardware engineering, historical market data. This is not personal investment advice, nor is it a recommendation to buy or sell any securities. You should always consult with a financial professional for your own portfolio.
Exactly. So let's start with the man of the hour.
Right. Which brings us to session one. Who exactly is John Ternus?
Right. Because if you aren't obsessively tracking Silicon Valley hardware engineering charts, that name might not trigger immediate recognition.
No, he isn't the guy pacing the stage in a black turtleneck making these sweeping philosophical declarations.
He's not. But let's open up his technical dossier, because his specific timeline at the company explains exactly why the board chose him. So, Ternus joined Apple's product design team way back in 2001.
Which, think about the context there. 2001 is a wildly different universe in tech.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
The original iPod was just being born. Mac OS X was brand new. So he comes in then, and he works his way up, becoming vice president of hardware engineering in 2013.
Which was right when the smartphone boom was really heavily maturing and, R&D budgets were just exploding.
Exactly. And then he formally joined the executive team in 2021, replacing Dan Riccio.
Yeah.
But what is crucial to understand about that trajectory is his intersectional expertise.
What do you mean by intersectional in this context?
Well, he is not just a software engineer who thinks purely in code, right? And he's not just an operations wizard who thinks purely in supply chain logistics. He sits precisely at the nexus of device architecture, industrial design constraints, and high-volume manufacturability.
So he understands how the physical parts actually have to fit together on an assembly line.
Exactly. Throughout his career, he oversaw the hardware engineering for every single generation of the iPad, the very first generation of AirPods, the iPhone 12 family. And he was the driving force behind that massive industry-rattling transition of the Mac to Apple Silicon.
I really want to zoom in on that iPad arc for a second, because I think it is the perfect lens to understand how he views consumer technology. If we rewind to, say, 2010, the original iPad was fundamentally a consumption slate.
Right, it was a giant iPhone screen.
Exactly. You bought it to read the news, watch a movie on an airplane, maybe play a lightweight mobile game. But if you track the evolution of that device under his stewardship, the entire philosophy of what a tablet even is changes.
It underwent a complete metamorphosis.
Okay.
And the real inflection point was 2021. That was the year the iPad Pro was infused with the M1 chip, the mini LED XDR display, and Thunderbolt connectivity.
Suddenly, it wasn't a mobile device masquerading as a computer anymore.
No, it became a thermally constrained expression of Mac-class silicon. He was taking literal desktop-grade processing power and forcing it to exist inside a sealed pane of glass that is, what, only a few millimeters thick.
And we really have to explain how crazy that is from a physics perspective, because when you put an Intel chip in a laptop back in the day, you had fans, you had copper heat pipes, you had massive vents.
Because a chip generates a massive amount of thermal energy.
Right. If you put that same Intel power into a sealed glass box, it should technically cook itself alive. The screen should warp, the battery should chemically degrade, and the processor should throttle down to a crawl within minutes just to save itself from catching fire.
Exactly. And that is why the silicon transition wasn't just about speed for Ternus, it was about thermal efficiency. The architecture of Apple's silicon allowed them to run massive calculations without generating the heat that traditional modular chips did. And he pushed this even further in 2024.
Oh, with the release of the incredibly thin M4 iPad Pro.
Right, the one that introduced the tandem OLED display.
Let's actually break down tandem OLED for a second, because it sounds like pure marketing jargon, but the mechanism behind it is fascinating.
It really is.
So a standard OLED screen emits its own light, pixel by pixel, which is great for contrast, but it requires a lot of power to get extremely bright.
Which in turn generates heat.
Right, heat that burns out the organic materials over time. So what Apple did with tandem OLED was stack two separate light-emitting layers directly on top of each other.
So instead of driving one layer incredibly hard to achieve the brightness required for, like, HDR video, you drive two layers at half the power.
They share the physical load?
Exactly. It dramatically reduces the heat generated by the display and massively increases the lifespan of the screen while still giving you that blinding peak brightness.
And the Silicon team at the time explicitly stated that it was the M4 chip's power-efficient performance combined with a brand new physical display engine carved directly into the silicon itself that made that insanely thin form factor possible.
You literally could not build the screen without the chip.
And you couldn't build the chassis without the screen. It is total vertical integration.
Which brings us perfectly to the 2025 iPad Pro with the M5 chip. Because that device was no longer marketed just for its thinness or its amazing screen. It was overtly positioned as a local AI powerhouse.
Right. Apple aggressively pitched the neural engine upgrades as the definitive hardware for running foundation models directly on the device.
Exactly. When you look at that timeline, from the 2010 consumption slate to the 2021 M1 integration to the 2024 tandem OLED thinness to the 2025 AI engine, you see Ternus's core belief system in action.
To him, silicon isn't just a spec bump.
No, it isn't just about faster load times. The chip is the literal, physical mechanism that dictates the device's shape, its thermal weight, its display capabilities, and ultimately how the consumer uses it.
And this exact same philosophy was applied to the Mac, but on a much grander scale. Think back to the dark days of the Mac around 2018 or 2019.
Oh, the thermal throttling days.
Yeah, they were stuck on Intel processors that ran incredibly hot. Apple wanted to make their laptops thinner and quieter, but Intel's chip architecture simply couldn't deliver the performance without drawing massive amounts of wattage.
And requiring loud cooling fans.
Right. The hardware design was fundamentally at war with the internal components.
It was a total breaking point. So in 2020, Apple initiates the transition. They rip the Intel chips out and drop in the M1. And the secret sauce there was the unified memory architecture.
Which is so important to understand because in a normal PC, the CPU, the brain, and the GPU, the graphics card, sit in different places on the motherboard.
Right, and they have their own separate pools of memory.
Exactly. So if they want to work on the exact same file, they have to copy the data back and forth across a physical bridge, which takes time and burns a ton of battery power.
It's like two separate offices trying to collaborate on a physical document by continuously photocopying it and mailing it back and forth down the hall.
Yep. That is a great analogy. So what Apple did with the M1 was fuse the CPU, the GPU, the neural engine, and a single massive pool of memory onto one physical piece of silicon.
Right, so now the CPU and GPU just point to the exact same memory address.
Zero copying, zero delay.
And the power savings from that were just astronomical. The M1 boasted the absolute best CPU performance per watt in the world literally doubling the battery life of the Macs that came before it.
And by 2023, with the massive M2 Ultra chip, they had scaled this architecture all the way up to their highest-end desktop workstations.
And the market absolutely rewarded that engineering risk.
Yeah.
If you look at the IDC data, the Mac's global market share roughly doubled, hitting about 11% by 2026.
They won over entire sectors of professionals, video editors, software developers, audio engineers, who realized they could compile code or render 4K video on a laptop while sitting on a park bench without the battery dying in 45 minutes.
Yeah, there is a quote from Ternus during that era that I think defines his worldview entirely. He was reflecting on the M1 transition, and he said that the new silicon made it seem as if the laws of physics had changed.
That is an intense way for an engineer to look at the world.
It really is.
Yeah.
But when you control the design of the chip, the speed of the memory, the code of the operating system, and the physical thermal envelope all at the same time, you stop having to make the frustrating trade-offs that the rest of the industry is bound by. You can essentially bend the constraints of reality.
Because he has this absolute, uncompromising obsession with vertical integration. He doesn't view it as some corporate strategy just to lock consumers in. He views it as the only practical tool to eliminate friction.
And his quality bar is famously intense.
Oh, yeah.
There's this anecdote floating around about him early in his career where he was arguing with a third-party supplier over the exact number of microscopic grooves on a screw that went inside a computer monitor.
A screw that the end user would literally never, ever see.
Exactly. It speaks to a level of fanaticism. He doesn't wake up thinking about how to ship a piece of technology. He thinks about how to ship a holistic experience that clears this intuitive, almost unreasonable standard of baseline quality.
Okay, but I feel like we have to push back here because no executive's record is flawless. We have to talk about the negative case, the spectacular failure.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
I am, of course, talking about the era of the butterfly keyboard.
Ah, yes. The great cautionary tale of Apple's modern era. Because in the late 2010s, during their pursuit of absolute thinness and visual minimalism, the hardware organization briefly lost its mind.
Completely.
They over-optimized for aesthetic elegance at the severe expense of physical tolerance, repairability, and consumer trust.
Let's explain the mechanics of why that keyboard was such a disaster for anyone who didn't suffer through it. A traditional laptop keyboard uses a scissor mechanism, two little interlocking plastic pieces that look like an X.
Right, and it gives the key enough travel to feel good when you press it.
Exactly, and there is enough empty space around the mechanism that if a crumb or a piece of dust falls in there, it doesn't break anything. But Apple wanted the laptop to be razor thin, so they replaced the scissor with a butterfly mechanism.
Which was a single rigid piece of plastic hinged in the center, like butterfly wings.
Right, and it had almost zero travel. But more importantly, the tolerances were so microscopic that a single speck of dust could wedge itself under the wing and completely paralyze the key.
It was a beautiful piece of engineering in a vacuum, but an absolute nightmare in the real world.
Yeah.
You had professional writers and coders carrying cans of compressed air in their backpacks just to keep their $3,000 laptops functioning.
It was absurd. Apple ultimately faced a $50 million class action settlement and had to initiate this massive, embarrassing, and highly expensive multi-year repair program.
To me, it's like a Formula One team designing a car.
Right.
They over-optimize completely for top speed. They layer the chassis to a millimeter above the ground. They strip away all the weight. They have the slickest aerodynamics on paper.
Yeah.
But they forget that the race is going to be held on a dirt road.
Yeah.
The moment that hyper-engineered car hits a single pebble, the suspension shatters and the car is out of the race. Apple built a keyboard for a sterile laboratory, not for the friction of a coffee shop.
That is the perfect analogy. And from 2019 to 2021, Apple had to execute a massive, humbling reset. They swallowed their pride and brought back the slightly thicker Magic Keyboard with the traditional scissor switches.
Thank goodness.
Right. They brought back the MagSafe charging connector, they brought back physical HDMI ports and SD card readers that they had previously stripped away in the name of minimalism.
Now, the public records don't pin the butterfly keyboard failure solely on Ternus. It was a broader cultural disease during the Dan Riccio era. But Ternus was the executive who helped lead that corrective reset.
Right, he was the one who oversaw putting the ports back in.
Exactly. It demonstrates that he absorbed the hard lesson. When you ignore the messy, edge case friction of everyday life, the users will punish your brand equity incredibly fast.
But see, here is where I want to challenge this whole narrative. Is this explanation just a little too neat?
How so?
Well, We are sitting here praising him as this humbled product perfectionist who mastered the laws of physics. But let's step back and look at the company as a whole. Apple is a financial and operational juggernaut. It is a machine that prints money for its shareholders.
Right.
So is there a genuine risk that putting a fanatical, engineering-first, product-obsessed CEO into the top job might actually be bad for the stock? Could he compress profit margins by insisting on absolute expensive perfection, forgetting that Apple is ultimately a massive global business, not a boutique design firm?
That is a very fair point, and it is the exact tension that institutional investors are fiercely debating right now. A perfectionist CEO can absolutely drive up R&D costs, delay product launches to get them just right, and insist on premium components that eat into the gross margin. But the counter-argument, and the one the board clearly believes, is that as we enter the AI era, engineering is the business model. The technical hurdles are now so staggeringly high, specifically regarding thermal limits, battery chemistry, and on-device processing, that if you don't have a perfectionist in charge, the product simply won't function at all. You can't market your way out of a melting chip.
That's a great point. So to wrap up session 1 and summarize the man himself, John Ternus is fundamentally a master of physical constraints. He deeply understands that the underlying silicon dictates what the hardware can be, and he has learned the hard way that a design that fails in the real world is entirely worthless.
Well said.
But to truly understand where he is taking the company, we have to look at the giants whose shoulders he is standing on. How does his engineering mindset fit into the broader, decades-long historical arc of Apple? We'll dive into that right after a quick break. All right, we are back.
Which brings us to session 2. What is the Jobs-Cook-Ternus lineage, and how does it define Apple's future? To answer that, we have to trace the lineage very carefully.
Let's wind the clock way back to set the historical context. If you look at the 1990s and early 2000s, the mainstream personal computing world was defined by one word: modularity.
Oh, yeah. The Wintel duopoly.
Exactly. Windows and Intel ruled everything. You had commodity physical components, hard drives, motherboards, sound cards built by a dozen different companies like Dell, HP, or Gateway.
Right.
Then you had a licensed operating system from Microsoft just slapped on top of it. The profit margins for the hardware makers were razor thin, and the consumer experience was totally fragmented. If your printer didn't work, Microsoft blamed Dell, Dell blamed the printer manufacturer, and the consumer was left hunting for driver installation CDs.
It was a nightmare. And even in the early mobile era, before the smartphone really crystallized, the market was heavily split. You had cell phones like Nokia and Motorola, whose only job was making phone calls and sending texts.
Right.
Then you had personal digital assistance PDAs, like the Palm Pilot or the Handspring Visor, which handled your calendar and contacts, but required a physical stylus and had no wireless connection. The functions were completely separate until low-power ARM processors and 3G cellular networks finally began to converge.
And Steve Jobs' counterposition to that entire established industry logic was total uncompromising integration. He fiercely argued that regular consumers do not want to buy a federation of parts.
They don't want to play systems integrator.
Exactly. They want one seamless, beautiful, reliable device where the hardware and the software are designed by the exact same people in the exact same building.
And that philosophy is what gave us the iPod. It wasn't just a hard drive with buttons. It was seamlessly integrated with iTunes on your computer, which was seamlessly integrated with the music store.
Right, it was a closed loop.
And of course, it gave us the iPhone. The iPhone's massive breakthrough wasn't just the multi-touch screen. It was the elimination of the physical keyboard and the stylus, replacing hardware constraints with dynamic software. Jobs built the ideological foundation of the integrated product.
Then, tragically, Steve Jobs passes away in 2011, and we enter the Tim Cook era. And the fundamental problem the company faced changed practically overnight.
How so?
Well, Apple didn't need to prove that integration was a good idea anymore. The iPhone had already conquered the global market and forced Google to scramble and launch Android just to keep up. The new problem was an operational one.
Ah, right. Scale.
Exactly. How do you take this hyper-integrated, incredibly complex product and scale it to 1 billion people globally without losing the soul and the quality control of the company?
And Cook's answer to that was absolute industrialization. He was an operations genius.
Yeah.
While the rest of the tech industry was leaning heavily into software, while Android was commoditizing hardware by giving the OS away for free.
Right.
And while Microsoft was going through its massive 2014 pivot toward mobile-first, cloud-first enterprise services, Tim Cook was quietly building a global operating system for Apple itself.
He literally transformed them from a tech company into a logistics superpower.
Precisely. He built impossibly tight supply chains. He invested billions in custom silicon control, buying up chip design firms. He grew the services revenue, the App Store, iCloud, Apple Music, into an economic behemoth that on its own would be a Fortune 50 company.
Which is just staggering to think about.
And crucially, he established a distinct, heavily marketed privacy posture that set Apple fundamentally apart from digital ad-driven platforms like Meta and Google. So if Jobs built the perfect product, Tim Cook built the unstoppable global machine around it.
Which brings us to today, the John Ternus era. And the landscape has shifted once again, this time because of generative AI.
Right.
To understand what Ternus is doing, we really have to look at the mainstream bets being made by his rivals right now in 2026. The entire industry is completely obsessed with the cloud.
Right. Google is pushing its Gemini models into their Pixel phones, but the heavy lifting still relies on Google Cloud.
Microsoft is trying to build a Windows AI layer with their Copilot plus PCs, heavily leveraging their massive investment in OpenAI's server infrastructure.
Meta is spending tens of billions of dollars outfitting data centers with NVIDIA GPUs while simultaneously pushing their Ray-Ban AI glasses.
The entire consensus of the tech industry is that AI is cloud-heavy, model-forward, and agentic. You build a massive godlike brain in a server farm in Ohio, and you stream the answers down to the user's phone.
But what is deeply fascinating here is Apple's explicit counterposition to that trend. In 2024, they introduced Apple Intelligence. And notice the branding there.
Yeah, they didn't call it a universal chatbot.
Exactly. They didn't frame it as an oracle that knows the sum of all human knowledge. They explicitly defined it as a personal intelligence system that is baked deeply and locally into the operating system itself.
And their entire architecture reflects that. They utilize something called private cloud compute, and we should definitely explain how radical this is. Please do.
When your iPhone actually does need to send a complex query to the cloud because maybe the local chip can't handle it, it doesn't just send it to a generic server. Apple designed custom servers using their own silicon.
Right.
The servers cryptographically prove to your phone that the software hasn't been tampered with. It processes your request and then instantly destroys the data. It is physically impossible for Apple to log, store, or monetize that data.
And by 2025, they went even further. They opened up their on-device foundation model to third-party developers. They explicitly framed it as an offline, fast, and entirely private engine.
So the strategy isn't to win a benchmark test answering trivia questions.
No, the goal is to make AI an ambient, invisible behavior of the ecosystem. Your Mac quietly summarizes a massive PDF while you are on an airplane with no Wi-Fi. Your Apple Watch nudges you about a scheduling conflict based on an email you received without ever sending that email to a server.
Your headset contextualizes the objects in your living room in real time. Exactly. So Ternus really represents the ultimate fusion of his predecessors. He possesses Jobs' intense intimacy with the physical product and user experience. He operates within the incredibly disciplined, cache-rich global machine that Cook built. And he leverages the custom silicon leverage that Johny Srouji has spent a decade perfecting.
Okay, that is a very strong, very bullish narrative, but let me step in and push back on this because it is exactly what skeptical analysts are asking right now.
Let's hear it.
Is this entire device-first, privacy-first AI philosophy just a remarkably convenient, well-marketed cover story?
Interesting.
We all know that Apple was caught somewhat flat-footed when the generative AI boom exploded in 2022 and 2023. Are they framing AI as a local, hardware-bound feature simply because they are vastly behind Google, Microsoft, and Meta in training massive frontier cloud models?
The GPU poor versus MPU rich debate.
Exactly. Is all this talk about ambient local AI just a defensive positioning to mask a massive strategic vulnerability in cloud computing?
It is the multi-trillion-dollar question. If Apple is merely playing defense, if they truly miss the boat on the cloud AI revolution, the market will eventually punish them relentlessly once cloud latency effectively drops to zero and consumers demand smarter, larger models.
Right.
But if Apple genuinely believes that local, private, highly contextual AI that understands your personal data without stealing it is the superior consumer experience, then this is an incredibly visionary stance. And frankly, we will not know the definitive answer to that for another few years as the software matures.
Right.
But this existential tension explains precisely why John Ternus is the guy in the big chair. If your entire corporate strategy relies on the actual physical hardware running advanced artificial intelligence locally, without burning the user's hand, without draining the battery in an hour, and without compromising data security.
You absolutely need a hardware savant in charge. You don't need a software guy. You need someone who understands thermodynamics. So, to wrap up session 2, the lineage is clear. Steve Jobs invented the tightly integrated device. Tim Cook scaled that device into an unprecedented global economic force. And now, John Ternus is tasked with embedding localized artificial intelligence directly into the physical silicon of those devices.
A massive undertaking.
It is. But here is the reality check. None of this elegant local AI strategy works if Apple can't actually manufacture the hardware at scale. And that brings us to the staggering, almost incomprehensible scale of Apple's operations today. We're going to take a very short break, and when we come back, we'll dive into the global machine. Welcome back. Let's get right into session 3. How does Apple's global machine operate today, and can Ternus drive it?
To understand the machine that Ternus is inheriting on day one, we have to look at the raw numbers. We have to track the sheer financial and operational explosion that occurred during Tim Cook's tenure.
Let's dig into the 10K filings, because the data tells a story that words can barely capture. Let's go back to 2005.
Okay, 2005. At that time, Apple reported $13.9 billion in total global sales. They had just 124 retail stores. And their manufacturing footprint was still relatively basic by modern standards. They still owned a physical manufacturing facility in Ireland and a primary distribution site in Sacramento, California.
You know, it's so funny to hear $13.9 billion described as basic, but in the context of Apple today, that is literal pocket change. It's a rounding error.
It really is. So jump forward to 2010. Sales have exploded to $65.2 billion. R&D spending is at $1.8 billion. This is the crucial era where Apple fundamentally transitioned its identity.
How so?
They stopped being a traditional manufacturer who built their own stuff, and they became what analysts call an orchestrator. They designed the products in California, but they orchestrated a massive web of third-party capacity, primarily Foxconn in China, to actually build them.
Right. Tim Cook famously called inventory fundamentally evil. He wanted components arriving at the factory hours before assembly, not sitting in a warehouse depreciating.
It's exactly. Then jump to 2015. Sales hit in an unbelievable $233.7 billion. And notably, Greater China made up a full quarter of that revenue. This wasn't just about cheap labor anymore. China was becoming their fastest-growing consumer market.
And then by 2020, the structure is deeply interdependent and heavily asset-light. They reported $49.9 billion in off-balance sheet purchase obligations.
Which basically means they were locking up the world's supply of CNC milling machines, memory chips, and displays years in advance.
And that brings us to the current day. If you look at the 2024 through 2026 filings, their net property and plant valuation sits at $50.2 billion. As of December 2025, their manufacturing purchase obligations money they are contractually committed to spending on supply chain components sits at a staggering $44.4 billion.
We're talking about a web of thousands of supplier facilities spread across more than 60 countries.
Which brings us to arguably the most delicate and complex geopolitical tightrope in corporate history. The geographic reallocation of the supply chain, often referred to as the China Plus One strategy.
Right.
And I want to be extremely clear here for the listener. As we discuss these geographic shifts between the US, China, India, and Vietnam, we are looking at this strictly through the lens of supply chain logistics, capital allocation, and risk exposure.
We're purely analyzing how a multinational corporation mitigates bottlenecks.
Exactly. The broader political discourse around international trade policies is a separate topic entirely. But looking at the hard data, the strategy is obvious. Apple is reallocating physically. However, they are not leaving China. That is a complete media oversimplification. You cannot simply unplug a machine that size. What they are doing is aggressively stretching the web.
If we look at the specific, actionable data points, the shift is undeniable. By the end of this year, 2026, Apple aims to have the majority of U.S.-sold iPhones fully sourced and assembled in India.
That is a monumental logistical achievement.
It is. In 2025 alone, Apple captured a 28% value share in the massive Indian smartphone market. And it's not just India. Vietnam is seeing enormous capital investments for the final assembly of iPads, AirPods, Apple Watches, and MacBooks.
But the gravity of China remains absolute, and let's explain why. You don't just build a factory by pouring concrete and hiring workers. You need an ecosystem.
Right.
China is the anchor for Apple because of the sheer density of component suppliers. If an engineer needs a custom microscrew adjusted in Shenzhen, the factory that makes that screw is a 10-minute drive away. In India, it might have to be flown in.
That clustering of engineering expertise and component density just cannot be replicated overnight.
Furthermore, from a sales perspective, Greater China sales grew 38% in the first quarter of 2026, driven heavily by the continued status symbol strength of the iPhone. So the machine is being stretched, it's being diversified to mitigate regional risk, but it is still deeply structurally reliant on its original center of gravity.
And that geographic complexity is currently compounding with a severe, almost intractable technological bottleneck. We have to talk about the semiconductor reality.
Yes, the silicon bottleneck.
When Apple brilliantly shifted to their own internal silicon, they solved their Intel problem. But they created a massive singular dependency on TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. They basically traded one bottleneck for another.
This is the $30,000 wafer problem we mentioned at the very top of the show. We are talking about manufacturing at the absolute bleeding edge of human capability. In April 2026, industry reports highlighted a bizarre logistical loop.
Oh, this is fascinating.
Yeah. TSMC built these massive new fabrication plants in Arizona, heavily subsidized by U.S. industrial policy. But the ultra-advanced chips made in Arizona often have to be physically loaded onto airplanes and shipped all the way back to Taiwan.
Why?
Because while Arizona can print the raw silicon, the advanced packaging ecosystem, the delicate process of wiring the chip to the memory and the motherboard, doesn't exist at scale in the U.S. yet.
It is called CoWoS chip on wafer on substrate. It's essentially a 3D puzzle where you stack memory directly next to the processor to increase speed. And furthermore, TSMC's upcoming 2-nanometer chips are facing intense physical challenges.
Right, because as you shrink the transistors closer and closer to the size of actual atoms, you face issues like quantum tunneling, where electrons literally jump across barriers they shouldn't be able to cross.
The chips generate intense, concentrated heat. TSMC is trying to manage these performance gains without relying entirely on even costlier next-generation lithography tools, and it is causing massive packaging bottlenecks.
And this right here is exactly why Ternus's operational edge is so vital for the CEO role right now. Why is a product design guy suited to inherit this sprawling, bottlenecked geopolitical supply chain?
Because in the 2-nanometer era, operations and product design are no longer separate phases.
Exactly. In the olden days, you could design a sleek laptop in California and then toss the blueprints over the wall to operations and say, figure out how to build 1 million of these. You can't do that anymore.
Ternus has to align the multi-year chip roadmaps, the advanced OLED display technologies, the specific chemical battery envelopes, and the massive Air-I memory requirements years earlier in the cycle. He works directly with the supply chain partners that have to invent the machines to industrialize these components before the final product design is even locked in.
Okay, but again, I have to challenge this setup.
Go for it.
We are looking at a stock market that is already exhausted. We just talked about the brutal March volatility. Is this entire China +1 geographic diversification strategy already fully priced into the stock? Has the market already rewarded Apple for moving to India?
That's a valid question.
And more importantly, let's be real about Ternus. He is fundamentally a product engineer. He is the guy who argues over the invisible grooves on a screw, is a perfectionist engineer genuinely equipped to navigate the intense geopolitical, regulatory, and macroeconomic labyrinth that Tim Cook spent 25 years mastering.
Look, if we look at the history of corporate successions, it's a completely valid fear. Look at Microsoft transitioning from Bill Gates to Steve Ballmer or GE after Jack Welch. Transitions are extremely dangerous.
Right.
Cook was a logistics prodigy. Ternus is a product prodigy. But the core argument Apple is making to its shareholders is that the logistical labyrinth is now fundamentally a physics and engineering labyrinth. If your team cannot figure out how to package a 2-nanometer AI chip without melting the motherboard, it literally does not matter how efficient your shipping lanes out of Vietnam are. The product will fail.
That's a great point. So to wrap up session 3, the global machine that Tim Cook built is undeniably more complex, vastly more expensive, and geographically stretched far thinner than ever before. John Ternus has to step in and keep that multi-trillion-dollar economic engine humming perfectly, satisfying Wall Street every 90 days, while simultaneously pushing his engineering teams to the absolute boundaries of quantum physics.
It's a monumental task.
It is. We are going to take one last quick break, and when we come back, we'll dive into the final session and ask, where is this multi-trillion-dollar machine actually heading by the end of the decade? And we are back for the final block.
Session 4. What will Apple Intelligence look like in 2030?
If we project out to 2030, Apple is attempting to build a very specific, incredibly lucrative moat. They do not want to be a chatbot destination.
Right.
They don't want you to pull your phone out, unlock it, open a specific app, and type a prompt into a text box to talk to an AI. That is a commoditized interface. They want to be the invisible, trusted runtime for all consumer AI interactions.
And we can already see the rigid foundation of that runtime being poured today.
Yeah.
Just look at the strict hardware limitations they've imposed on Apple Intelligence. It requires an iPhone 15 Pro or an M1 and later iPad or a Mac.
They drew a massive, uncompromising line in the sand. They left millions of perfectly good, older iPhones out in the cold.
Because it proves that their entire strategy is inextricably bound to hardware capability specifically, the memory bandwidth required to load the model, the neural processing units required to run the math, and the strict power budgets required to not kill the battery.
And their private cloud compute architecture is designed from the ground up to ensure data is never stored and is physically inaccessible. That is the 2030 moat. Absolute behavioral trust, cryptographically enforced by custom silicon.
But to actually realize that 2030 vision, there are 3 massive, almost insurmountable engineering hurdles standing in Ternus's way over the next 5 years.
Let's break those down. The first major hurdle is spatial computing.
Right.
The upcoming M5 chip architecture is heavily tied to the future of the Vision Pro platform, constantly pushing for more pixels, wider fields of view, and higher refresh rates to prevent motion sickness.
But as the market reaction to the initial Vision Pro showed us, the primary issue with spatial computing isn't raw graphical power. The real issues are cost, physical weight, thermal comfort on the face, and what analysts are calling social wearability.
Contrast Apple's current approach with Meta. Meta is heavily pushing their Ray-Ban smart glasses. They are much cheaper, they lack heavy screens, but they are socially legible.
Right, you can wear them in a coffee shop without looking like a cyborg.
Exactly. They have a camera and an AI assistant built in. Can Ternus engineer a way to take Apple's massive computational ecosystem and make spatial computing feel consumer normal, rather than like a heavy, isolating science project strapped to your face?
It's a huge question of miniaturization, which leads directly to the second massive hurdle, advanced silicon and thermals. As we touched on earlier, the industry throws the term 2 nanometer around in press releases like it's just a simple marketing label for faster.
Oh, it's so much more than that.
But shrinking the node architecture to that level represents a terrifying packaging and thermal management crisis. Future on-device AI requires moving massive amounts of data from the memory to the processor constantly.
And doing that generates heat.
If you want a local large language model analyzing your screen context in real time, it is running continuously in the background. Doing that without melting the device or draining the battery in an hour is incredibly difficult.
Success here depends entirely on balancing RAM capacity with acoustics and cost. You simply cannot have an iPhone that sounds like a jet engine cooling fan when you ask it to summarize a text message.
Exactly. And that thermal and power constraint leads us directly into the third and perhaps most stubborn hurdle, the battery question.
Oh, the battery.
If you dig deeply through Apple's public SEC filings, their R&D expenditure reports, and their supplier materials, there is absolutely no confirmed public roadmap for solid-state batteries in the near future.
Right, and let's explain that. Current lithium-ion batteries use a liquid electrolyte to move ions back and forth. They are heavy, they degrade over time, and they have a hard physical limit on how much energy they can store.
The holy grail of the industry is the solid-state battery, which replaces the liquid with a solid material, making it vastly more energy-dense and much safer.
But manufacturing them at the scale of 200 million iPhones a year is proving to be a nightmare for the entire industry.
Since they aren't relying on a magical new battery chemistry saving the day by 2030, the current lithium-ion battery remains the hidden governor on everything. It strictly limits the always-on AI features, the persistent spatial cameras, the augmented reality workloads.
Ternus cannot wait for a miracle. He has to innovate and squeeze every drop of efficiency within the stubborn confines of current battery physics.
So this is the ultimate defining test for the upcoming era of consumer tech. If Ternus and his hardware team succeed, AI will simply feel like an ambient, frictionless property of the hardware you already own. You won't even think about it. Your devices will just seamlessly anticipate your needs, process your life, and protect your data.
But if he fails to manage the thermals, the memory bandwidth, and the battery life, the center of consumer attention will inevitably migrate. It will move to cloud-based assistants like OpenAI or Google Gemini that sit above the operating system, bypassing Apple software entirely.
And if that happens, the multi-$1,000 Apple hardware is relegated to being just a beautiful, premium, but fundamentally dumb glass screen that merely serves as a portal to someone else's intelligence.
Which brings up an existential long-term risk here, which is something that has to keep their executives awake at night.
What's that?
What if global cloud infrastructure continues to evolve at a breakneck speed? What if, by the 2030s, breakthroughs in networking infrastructure drop cloud latency effectively to zero?
Wow.
If a consumer can get an instantaneous, hyper-intelligent response from a massive server farm 1,000 miles away and the bandwidth is perfectly reliable, does Apple's obsessive, intensely expensive focus on local thermal budgets and localized memory bandwidth become completely irrelevant?
That is the ultimate nightmare scenario for the company. If the speed of light and ubiquitous fiber optics render local processing unnecessary, then all of this agonizing over $30,000 wafer packaging and 2-nanometer thermal engineering was a colossal waste of capital. Why put the brain in the phone if the phone can just instantly access a godlike brain in the cloud?
Exactly. But Apple is placing a multi-trillion-dollar bet on human nature. They are betting that the laws of physics regarding latency, the absolute necessity for privacy, and the sheer reliability of local compute when you are offline will always win out in the consumer's hand.
It is arguably the most fascinating high-stakes wager in modern corporate history.
It truly is. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the research. To recap everything we've unpacked today, we are witnessing the passing of the baton at one of the world's most important companies.
Right.
The Tim Cook era of pure operational mastery, where the global supply chain was the ultimate competitive weapon, is officially transitioning to the John Ternus era of engineering-first problem-solving. The constraints defining the next decade are no longer just logistical or geographical. They are deeply physical, computational, and thermodynamic.
It is a massive structural pivot for a company of this unprecedented size.
That's our look at the incoming Ternus era, a future where Apple is betting $30,000 per wafer that they can physically fit the entire world's intelligence into a device that doesn't melt your hand or violate your privacy. It's a massive amount of data to process. But then again, after what the markets put us through back in March with those dizzying drops and spikes, we're all getting pretty good at handling unprecedented thermal stress in our own portfolios. So as we transition from the corporate era of inventory is evil to the new era of physics is hard, just remember, if your tech portfolio still feels a little thin after the recent volatility, you can always confidently tell people you've simply been re-engineered for pragmatic minimalism. Good night, and may your neural engine stay local, even if your manufacturing base is currently stretched somewhere between Chennai and Hanoi.
Before we go, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over regarding everything we've discussed today. We've spent this entire time dissecting advanced silicon, sprawling supply chains, and incredibly complex thermal budgets. But what if Apple's most valuable asset in the year 2030 isn't their cutting-edge 2-nanometer chips or their supply chain mastery at all? What if their ultimate moat is simply the deeply ingrained behavioral trust of billions of users, a consumer base that has been meticulously trained for over a decade not to hand their personal context and data over to a third-party AI?
Let us know in the comments if you're buying into the Ternus era of local hardware or if you're keeping your chips in the cloud.